As I said last week, that the author of the book of Esther is just so ingenious in crafting a story for us that teaches us ultimately deep theological truths around the providence of God, but also a story that offers to us priceless life lessons on power, pride, prejudice, and privilege. And so when it comes to pride and prejudice, you've got to hear this. Warning, here it is, beware of your wounded pride and the prejudices it's capable of spewing. That's the warning. Beware of your wounded pride and the prejudices it's capable of spewing. And so don't think yourself to be removed, far removed or distant from actually causing unfathomable harm to people when you choose to harbor the attitudes of a wounded pride. Listen, it will always boil over. It will always boil over into acts of prejudice against others. Such is the deceptiveness of deep-seated pride. It blinds us of the depth of depravity we may descend into whenever it's been wounded. Blinds us of that. So you've got to be aware of your wounded pride and the prejudices it's capable of spewing. Now, I know in some ways, if you were asked this morning, if you knew the kind of depraved acts of prejudices that can ensue from your wounded pride, would you still harbor that pride? I think most of us would say, of course not. Of course not. But here's the thing, would you then be surprised to actually learn that Haman would have answered just like you and me? Would have answered just like you and me. And so here's this man in the Bible that we can quickly write off as being the despicable and evil and depraved, and yet when confronted with the depth of his own depravity, he instinctively responded in a way of saying like, sure, far it be from me to commit such acts of depravity. Now, where do I get that? Come with me in Exodus chapter 7, verse 7. The king arose in his wrath and went into the palace garden, but Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. And so now, having been confronted with the fullness of what he was actually plotting, of the depravity of it all, what does Haman immediately decide to say? Whoa, wait a minute, this has gone far further than I could have ever intended. And so and that's what? He starts to beg the queen for his life, now that his plans have come to the fullness of light. Now, I wonder, what are some of the things he could have been saying to Queen Esther, do you think? Wouldn't it be something along the lines of like, my queen, forgive me. I did not know. I didn't intend for that to mean precisely your death, right? That would have been the response as he's begging for his life. And so desperate does he get to beg for different kind of interpretation to what was actually unfolding once he's now having to reckon with these acts of prejudice and the depravity that it has now gone into. So desperate is he to beg for his life that he forgets some of the rules that govern Persian harem protocol. And so some of those rules were what? One, no man could be left alone with one of the women in the king's harem. And so what should have happened was the moment that the king had stepped out into the garden, he should have left the room. But the man is so desperate to justify himself and the depravity that he's now saying, he remains in the room. And then the second misstep that happens is that even in presence of others, you were never allowed to come within 7 steps of a woman in the king's harem. But what does this cat do? he falls on the couch where Esther was. And then what happens? Verse 8, and the king returned from the palace garden as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. This man has got to be either one of the most unluckiest people in the whole world, or is there something else happening in the story? As the king returns, just at that precise moment as the king is returning, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was, and the king said, will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house? And as the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. And he's like, oh my gosh, what have I done? My fate is sealed. And so here's the irony. He gets condemned to death for serious crimes he didn't set out intentionally to commit. You see that? He's condemned to death for treason in having plotted to try to kill the queen, which is not something he has set out intentionally to do. And he's convicted for death for having attempted to assault the queen sexually, which we know is not what he was trying to do. And so, beware. Beware of your wounded pride and the prejudices it's capable of spewing. Why? For it may take you to depraved places you don't intend to go. For it may take you to depraved places you don't intend to go. Now, as much as we should be aware of our wounded pride and the prejudices it's capable of spewing, because it may lead us to places where we don't intend to go. As important as that lesson is, life lesson is, there's actually a greater reason why we should be aware of this. And it is this, because in those depraved places that our wounded pride and its acts of prejudice may take us, in those depraved places, it will bring us face to face with the judgment of God for our pride and our prejudice. And that's the tragedy of Haman's story. That out of a wounded pride, that spewed into acts of prejudices, that took him to places where he didn't intend to go, he still suffered God's judgment for having gone there. And so what did we see in the story in the first week? We saw how Haman suffers such a sudden and swift downfall, right? And so he enters the presence of the king and prescribes a procession of honor intended for himself. And then what happens? It becomes a procession for his arch enemies, Mordecai. He boasts to his friends and his wife of being invited as a guest of honor to a celebration by the queen. And then that invitation becomes an invitation to his own execution. He builds a gallows to have his arch enemy killed upon. And then that becomes his own hangman's noose. And to top that all, the king just so happened to walk in the room at the exact time that he was falling on the couch where Esther was. And so, friends, are those just coincidences? Or is it God, by his providence, nailing his final judgment over Haman? And so here's the sobering reality that we got to come to terms with God's providence this week. And it is this, that God's providence administers both salvation and judgment. God's providence administers both salvation and judgment. The book of Esther is a book where we simultaneously see God delivering the undeserving and destroying the guilty by his same providence. By the same providence, his providence. He delivers the undeserving and he destroys the guilty, all by the same providence. Now, friends, we cannot sanitize that reality and that truth. And here's why. Because if you try to sanitize that reality, that God both delivers and destroys by his providence, you will miss the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ if you try to sanitize that. For what happens in the gospel? What do we see? We see people like you and me, right, who could be guilty of acts of prejudice out of our wounded pride. And when we're guilty of such acts of prejudice out of our wounded pride, what do you expect the righteous and just God to do with you? And to do with you because of your guilt. And so you cannot just sort of balance out that guilt by doing greater efforts of good, doing good, so that somehow God will forget about your acts of prejudice. That comes from a wounded pride that then leads to depraved and devastating consequences in life. You cannot just simply balance it out with good deeds. For at every point and juncture that you find yourself guilty of a wounded pride that spews out prejudices, there at that point, God must judge if he is righteous. And so the only way you can be absolved of such recompense is by turning to and hoping in what else God in his providence has made available to the guilty. And it is what? Justification by faith and grace alone at the cross of Christ. That's the only way. That's the only way. And so what do we see in the gospel of Jesus Christ? We see in the gospel of Jesus Christ God delivering the undeserving. That is us. In our wounded pride and our acts of prejudices that bear serious consequences into the world, God delivers the undeserving, that's us, while simultaneously he destroys the guilty, that is Jesus Christ himself when he took on the guilt of our pride and our prejudices on him at the very same cross. And so we see at the cross deliverance for the undeserving and destruction for the guilty, in Christ Jesus himself. And so what is the gospel teaching us? It is teaching us this, that God's providence prevails over the depravity of our pride and prejudice through the cross and the empty grave. That's the only way. That God's providence prevails over the depravity of our pride and prejudices through the cross of Jesus Christ. And that's why we look to Christ as our hope. That's why we look to Christ and the newness of life that comes through Christ to lead lives to the glory of our God, our ultimate joy and the good of others.